You can sanction the country, you can refuse to have relations with them, you can blockade their ports, you can declare a no-fly zone. It's not a nuclear power like Pakistan. What are they going to do? Choke the country and bring them to their knees, and you tell them that it's conditional upon the protection of minorities and the restoration of democracy in the country.
How Hasina was received by the Chinese, I think it was a clear indication that her policy of trying to balance multiple powers was not going to work. Her proximity to India, I think that irked the powers in Beijing.
The US collects client states like Pokemons. They have this pathological need and desire to collect as many as they can. The same way Amit Shah, wants to get as many seats in parliament as possible.
We have to remember that the Islamists are ideologically committed. So they are the most useful foot soldiers for any great power to create and to seed and create chaos, and eventually use that chaos to either contain countries or simply use them to destabilize and break countries.
It's not enough to just break down the states. What we should do is strip them of legislative power. Why do we need legislative assemblies acting as mini parliaments? Why do we need chief ministers acting like the rajas of each state as their fiefdom?
You will draw the flag, the ire of pretty much every so-called democratic regime in these Western countries. Do you have the courage, number one, to push back against it, call a spade, and say that we don't care?
Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. The focus for today's discussion is the situation in Bangladesh. Of course, we're all seeing dramatic visuals of what is happening there. July, August of this year has been a tumultuous time for the country. Just last week, August 5th, the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was deposed and she flew to India. We're going to talk about the social, political, and the economic condition in Bangladesh leading up to this and the future ahead. My guests today are two fantastic Bharatvaarta guests extraordinaires. Ruchir Sharma is an international affairs and social entrepreneurship expert across India and Europe. Of course, Ruchir is a staple on geopolitics. He's appeared on multiple different podcasts and is fairly popular on Twitter as well. My other guest, also popular on Twitter, is Surya Kanegaonkar. He's been on Bharatvaarta earlier discussing the Pegasus episode that happened well before. He's a commodities investor and a columnist, and his focus areas are natural resources, international trade, geopolitics, and economic security. This was a wonderfully nuanced discussion, and as I mentioned in the podcast, it is a podcast of podcasts. You will find multiple different rabbit holes that you can go down on, quite a few red pills, and unfortunately black pills as well. So yeah, I hope you like this. Hey Ruchir, hey Surya, welcome back to the Bharatvaarta podcast. It's been a long time. Great to have you guys back.
Thank you. Appreciate you for hosting this.
Yeah, thanks for thinking of us. Good to be back.
Awesome. So, there's no dearth of content these days, right? There's a ton of things happening, and specifically, I want to talk about everything that's happening with Bangladesh, right? So, Surya, opening question to you. We've all seen Sheikh Hasina's exit on August 5th. I want to trace back to a few days, perhaps weeks or months leading up to it. What were like the main triggers for this? If you could just set the context for this conversation, that'd be awesome.
Sure, Roshan. I think this is actually quite a tectonic shift in India's neighborhood. There was clearly pressure on the Hasina government, which was building since 2021. We have seen, sanctions on on some of her paramilitary forces, which were involved in crackdowns on terrorist groups by the U.S. So those sanctions were imposed. We've seen many comments from Washington about the quality of democracy and the sort of authoritarian control, apparently, that Hasina has been exercising over Bangladesh. Now, The extent to which this would have gone, probably um, people expected it, that there could be some sort of effort to destabilize the government. That did happen in some ways during the elections, but she managed to hold on. Then you ended up seeing some student groups which were backed by BRAC, which is an institution which had which got funding from the Gates Foundation and U.S. aid. They were actively involved in these so-called pro-democracy protests. And as we can see that as this escalated, as the violence escalated, um, the the motley group of protesters included other members of the political class, including members of the Jamaat, and basically lumpen elements who were pushed into action. Now, I don't think that it's really a two-dimensional sort of picture out there. We need to look at it from the point of view of how other elements which are there in the Bangladeshi military, which perhaps were more sympathetic to Hasina, ended up turning and buckling under pressure. There were and Hasina herself has talked about U.S. pressure to set up a military base in St. Martin's Island, and the sort of impact that would have had, the levers people were pulling to try and achieve that outcome from, especially from outside and in the West. It was not just the U.S. There were elements in the U.K. We've seen the media play up certain aspects of this regime change as something that's very positive, and it's been a coordinated effort which we've seen culminate in this, and it will continue to grow. The narrative will continue to grow in this sort of pro Western way going forward.
Right. A quick follow-up to you, right? I mean, the Bangladesh economy was touted to be like, an example for the rest of us to follow and so on, right? What really went wrong? I mean, of course, there was COVID, and post that, this whole rejigging of supply chains and perhaps lesser demand and whatnot. But how did it come to a point where people are so disgruntled that they want to overthrow government?
I think that there are two aspects of this. One is the political aspect, where people were feeling that there clearly is a very pro BNP, pro Jamaat sentiment in Bangladesh, and they have been suppressed in some ways they were suppressed by the Awami League. And it was a binary option in some ways for India who to support, because you really don't have any other elements besides the Hasina government, and maybe some in other parts of the military who you could kind of support. But the pressure cooker that was building, and that kind of exploded in some ways because there was economic problems out there. You saw the overall GDP grow, but inflation hit Bangladesh particularly hard. India stepped in to try and ease that financial burden to a large extent, and tried to guarantee supply of electricity, to make sure that the Indian currency could be used more freely. And it did ameliorate the situation to some degree, but it could not revive the economy. The economy itself has not been diversified to the extent that is required to insulate it from major external shocks. And we have seen, for example, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, currency crises, because their central banks and the sort of monetary and fiscal policies that they adopt are not calibrated to deal with these kinds, the magnitude of external shocks that we have seen. So India has been the stabilizing force for Bangladesh and for Sri Lanka. But from the political angle, if you see that this gave an opening for foreign powers to come in, to settle scores, to enact the regime change that they would like, and create the geopolitical outcomes that those regime changes would end up delivering. So I think that we have to look at the economic and political aspects together, and the limitations of India's foreign policy in the region, and also what the interests are from abroad.
Right. So the economy was more like a forcing function to the political instability that was already afoot, right? So,
Yes.
right.
What's also characteristic of the Bangladeshi economy is wage suppression. That even though the GDP went up and the GDP per capita went up, that doesn't mean it translated into wages. That meant productivity went up. So they were selling high value exports primarily to the West. So the EU is Bangladesh's main trading partner. So that's 21% of their total trade. And because Bangladesh is considered an LDC, a least developed country, it benefits from the most favorable regime possible in terms of its trade relations with the European Union. But in order to make that profitable, wages in Bangladesh have been suppressed for a very long time. And you can see that in their consumption patterns, that even though they're more or less the same level at GDP per capita to India, if you look at consumer goods, washing machines, air conditioners, if you look at the sales of passenger cars, if you look at appliances, it's much, much lower. So the quality of life, the standard of living for Bangladeshi citizens is much lower, despite the industrial sector being, in theory, more productive or more profitable, so to speak. And that leads to frustrations, but that's more of a recent phenomenon, like Surya said, with inflation, that then it causes social frictions. But I've seen reports from a longer period talking about the BNP and its support abroad, its support in the diaspora, its support in Western capitals. And they were waiting for the right moment to seed this sort of color revolution.
Right. So, Ruchir, Surya mentioned regime change. Right now, from the outside, maybe we're connecting too many dots, but then think about it, right? There's political instability, which was perhaps fomented further. There's a certain media narrative that is building up. And then you see these so-called spontaneous protests, erupting, right? I mean, all of this we have seen in other parts, and on hindsight, everything was quite well orchestrated, right? I mean, so do you think that the US sort of orchestrated all of this down to the last detail?
Oh, it's not just I who think that. That's what Sheikh Hasina herself has said. That's what the Awami League leadership has said in the run up to these events and afterwards as well. So, in the preceding months, a number of ministers from the erstwhile ruling party, the Awami League, were attacking U.S. diplomats and Western journalists who are focusing on Bangladesh, saying that they were hand in glove with the BNP and with the Jamaat al-Islami, that they were looking to destabilize Bangladesh by putting sanctions on senior government officials and military officials, that they can't visit the West, they can't visit the US. And this was getting more and more tense. This relationship between not just the Bangladeshi government and the U.S. embassy in Dhaka, but also with Western media, so the proxies of the U.S. Administration. But it got more and more tense, as you saw a few months ago. Sheikh Hasina mentioned publicly that there are plans afoot by the US to carve out a Christian state from Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar, similar to East Timor, is what she said. And she claimed that back in January, she was offered an easy re election if she permitted a foreign nation to establish an air base in Bangladesh. Now, she didn't disclose the country's name, but there's only one country that manipulates elections in such a way and makes these sorts of regime change threats and asks for these concessions in return. So, and she ruled out it being China, she ruled out it being Pakistan, she ruled out it being India, because she said the offer came from a white man. So then that's quite clear. So that means it's the US, or sometimes to do their dirty work, you have countries like Germany or Canada who do it to give plausible deniability. So this has been in the works for a while. In addition to that, at the time of recording earlier today, Sheikh Hasina released the speech that she had intended to make when on her last day before she was forced out of the prime ministership. So, as I recall, when she was pressured to resign, she asked to do a broadcast to the nation. But the Bangladeshi military said that there wasn't enough time and she needed to be evacuated before the protesters stormed a gun bhavan, I think it's called, the prime minister's residence. So she didn't have the chance to record that. Today, she released the full transcript of what she was going to say. And in that, she said, and I quote, "I resigned so that I did not have to see the procession of dead bodies. They wanted to come to power over the dead bodies of students, but I did not allow it. I resigned from the premiership. I could have remained in power if I had surrendered the sovereignty of St. Martin Island and allowed America to hold sway over the Bay of Bengal. I beseech the people of my land, please do not be manipulated by radicals." So, that's it from the horse's mouth. It doesn't matter what I think or anyone else thinks. When Sheikh Hasina herself has documented it, it hasn't come out of nowhere. It's come out over a long period of months. Then it's very clear which direction she's pointing in.
There was a fantastic article in Swarajya which discussed in detail this plan to carve out a Christian state from parts of Bangladesh in northeast India and Myanmar. And if we see one of the quotes from one of the officials, senior officers of Bangladesh's NSI, who's been working with the Indian agencies on counterterrorism, I quote here: "The Kuki-Chin groups are amassing weapons in Bangladesh and making strategic alliances with Islamist terror groups like the Jamaatul Ansar fil Hindal Sharqiya. They're also slowly gathering international attention by alleging that the Kuki-Chin people in Bangladesh are a heavily persecuted lot. The Kukis are doing the same in Manipur and have already succeeded in projecting themselves as a people who are persecuted because they are Christian. Many Christian communities and groups across the West, across the world, especially in the West, have started extending support to the Kukis in Manipur and Bangladesh." Now, we see that this has been a big theme, a major theme, even in the European Union. We have seen people in the EU Parliament raising this issue about Manipur, about the supposed persecution of Christians, when the reality is that the demographics of our northeastern states are getting changed because a part of Myanmar, which is really not under the control of the junta, the military, is kind of dominated to some extent by all kinds of foreign-backed factions, which are involved in evangelical activities. They are pushing people across the border and creating ethnic conflicts. Now, the extent to which India can go out officially to name the perpetrators behind these subversive activities, I mean, there are probably limits to it, strategic limits to it. But what we see is that within the Indian media commentariat, there are many who refrain from naming those who should be named based on very clear evidence. And that should really be a point of concern for us, because within our country, if we have analysts, people in the media who are unwilling to discuss the truth, then it means that there's something that we need to address within the country before also we even address issues outside, because we cannot allow our narrative. We should be having a national narrative for what's going on, right? I mean, that's what I would expect.
Yeah. So I'll come to the Indian response, particularly of the left and liberal types here, right? But again, one follow-up question to Ruchir, right? So what is the larger intent behind all of this? I mean, is it that the US wants like a client state in this region? Does it want to sort of have instability so that they can use it as some kind of a leverage, as a bargaining chip to sort of keep India in check? Or they're looking at it purely transactionally? I mean, it could be like a military base on an island, or it could be some kind of a Christian state, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think the first two are very plausible. That the US collects client states like Pokemons. They have this pathological need and desire to collect as many as they can. The same way Amit Shah, wants to get as many seats in parliament as possible. 300, 400, one day 500. The US, sees the world in these terms that there's client states, potential client states, and rogue states. Now, Bangladesh, they felt was at risk of being a rogue state because they weren't playing nicely. They didn't want to give a military base on St. Martin Island. They were quite close to India and reasonably close to China as well. So then the best way to convert a potential rogue state into a client state is through regime change. And this is quite similar. There's a number of commentators who have noted the parallels of what's happened in Bangladesh to what's happened in Ukraine in 2014 with the Maidan movement, with the Euro Maidan as it was called, which similarly turned a country that was ostensibly neutral and, let's say, mildly pro-Russian into a US garrison and client state that is committing, let's say, demographic and military suicide as we speak on behalf of the US. And you see, Americans saying, "Oh, this was the best investment ever. Without shedding a single drop of American blood, we're bleeding out the Russians." Now, that brings us to the second theory. You said that, is it to create this sort of garrison? Is it to destabilize India? Then yes, it opens up another front. India already has a number of hostile neighbors. So Pakistan is one, China is another, and so far the Indian government had been working very hard and in close coordination with Sheikh Hasina to keep relations there quite strong. Now, if this leads to an Islamist takeover or a BNP or Jamaat-e-Islami takeover of Bangladesh, it opens up a third front, which distracts the Indian defense preparations in the Himalaya, which covers both Pakistan and Kashmir, and that means resources and attention have to be diverted to the eastern border, which is already sensitive demographically and politically because of the Trinamool Congress being in power in West Bengal, which has cultivated a large and lumpen and violent cadre through let's say, the assimilation of illegal Bangladeshi immigrants. So that opens up a hornet's nest. Now, this has the potential to destabilize India at will, because you have three different theaters in which this can take place, and it can cause complete policy paralysis because it gives them veto power over not just India's foreign policy but domestic policy. If we do anything that can be perceived to be hostile to Western interests or Chinese interests, for that matter, if we do anything that is designed for domestic power consolidation or power projection geopolitically within our region, within the Indo-Pacific, or within the larger Eurasian sphere, then these are levers that can be used against us to make us back down. And so that's quite a big risk. And then the third one, where purely transactional, if it were purely transactional, they would just offer to pay the new regime to rent that island as a base. Then the question of creating a Christian, Protestant, evangelical garrison state wouldn't arise, because then if you already got everything you wanted by renting a military base or leasing that island for 99 years, what's the need to then punish that country by carving districts out of it to create a new one? So then it's ideological, that they know that that these rebels in these three countries are being, since they're Protestant and evangelical, they're getting their funding from U.S. churches, from churches in Texas and the U.S. South, and they will be loyal to these churches, which very often are CIA fronts. So it's I think that means it's not just transactional; it's an ideological component to it.
I would like to add one point to this. This is there's another interesting element is when you look at the Western Burma and Northern Burma, they're some of the largest drug producing regions in the world. And in fact, ever since the Taliban retook control of Kabul, and actually over the last few years, you've seen the drug production decline significantly out there. The center of production has now moved to Myanmar and also into parts of Northeast India, which is actually fueling a lot of narco terrorism. If we go back in time and look at the drug production in Afghanistan during the American occupation, it surged. It surged to new highs, and then only when the Taliban retook control, it started declining because it was in the Taliban's interest not to allow these sort of crops to be used in exchange to be exchanged for money and be used to destabilize the Taliban rule itself. But one of the reasons why the drugs trade is a very important one for supporting terrorism and supporting insurgencies is because these sort of trades go off outside the budget. You don't actually have to support this in the sort of way which you would traditionally in sort of part of your foreign policy. And because they're off the books, now you see the theater shift, and these are self-funded terrorist networks now. And you have a Christian separatist network which is getting revived after several years after the BJP decided to pay special attention to the Northeast. A lot of the effort that was put in, resources and relationships in developing relationships in the region, now that has come under pressure. It's a big power play as well, where the United States is able to show that no matter what you do in your country, we can change the circumstances around to the point that we can undo goodwill that you have built. We can undo the sort of economic leverage that you may have either in Bangladesh or in some other parts of the region. And we can destabilize it to the point that you simply cannot win. It's a mind game as much as it is a geopolitical game. And that's something we need to understand because policymakers, strategic thinkers who are planning the next phase of India's economic and geopolitical strategy would feel that they would have to recalibrate their plans based on what we see and the sort of history of their wins and losses.
So do you think China sat this one out, or they're kind of opportunistically using what's happening for their benefit? I don't think Sheikh Hasina was well received as well, right, on her last visit to China, and there was some sort of a friction as well. So yeah, talk us through that relationship and how that
Right.
perhaps factored in this.
I think that the Chinese wanted to expand their naval presence in the Bay of Bengal. And this, in some ways, is a direct contest between the US and China for that sort of presence. And neither of these powers are welcomed by India in its backyard. So India doesn't have that sort of leverage to kind of squeeze them out necessarily, but hold down the sort of region for as long as they possibly can. And that's what they did. But when you look at how how Hasina was received by the Chinese, I think it was a clear indication that her policy of trying to balance multiple powers was not going to work. Her proximity to India was also, especially over the Tista issue, I think that irked the the powers in Beijing, and they probably would have got an understanding of what is actually happening in Bangladesh, that she may not last for very long in that seat of power. Um, and in some ways, this was an inevitability, that she was going to, at some point, either resign or move out of politics. It was going to happen. The forces that were going to take over were going to be more Islamist in nature, which in some ways suits the Chinese, but not entirely, because we do have some concerns the Chinese have over ETIM and some of the Islamist groups which can kind of work with them in destabilizing Western China. So I think this is that they probably. I mean, I have no way to guarantee to say this for certainty, but they probably are on the back foot. But they do have influence in Bangladesh, economic influence, some sort of strategic depth. It's not like India doesn't as well, because of its geography and the fact that it has power lines, oil pipelines in that place where there are contracts given to people of influence. Whether now they're the beneficiaries of those economic arrangements in Bangladesh are just going to move from the Awami League to other groups in the country. Now, those groups will still end up negotiating with India, and India is basically surrounding. It just surrounds Bangladesh, so it is going to be the dominant force just by in terms of geography. But now what has happened is that it might somehow be about India and the US coordinating a few aspects of the development and the path that Bangladesh will take going forward, with the US having an upper hand and a veto in that process. And this can be used to counter the Chinese. So they, in some ways, do feel on the back foot. But we have to remember that the Pakistanis have been used by the US, because the Jamaat has been influenced significantly by Pakistan and their agencies. So now Pakistan is essentially a semi-client state of China. So when you look at it like this, that the only loser in this, really strategic loser, is India, and to some extent the Chinese. And Pakistan is going to be the balancing factor out here, just as they played the bridge between the US and China in the 1970s to bring those two countries together. Now they're playing this role where they arbitrage between Beijing and Washington, even in third countries.
Right. Sometimes I think the most valuable thing about Pakistan is the geopolitics, right? So they somehow figure a way to get in between these things and use it to their leverage.
That's because their elites have been cultivated. Their elites have been used to advance the goals of foreign powers in the subcontinent. And we have to remember that the Islamists are ideologically committed. So they are the most useful foot soldiers for any great power to create and to seed and create chaos, and eventually use that chaos to either contain countries and ultimately create the geopolitical outcome they want in a certain region, or simply use them to destabilize and break countries. So this has been a policy of the United States, even in Soviet Afghanistan. Pakistan essentially grew on American patronage from the 1950s, when they were part of CENTO. They were a major non-NATO ally. They continue to be a major non-NATO. They were armed with a nuclear weapon. They did not develop that nuclear weapon indigenously. They have been bankrolled for decades with billions and billions of dollars. The elite have 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 spent their money abroad, buying assets off other, say, politicians or people of influence, bidding up, say, real estate prices in the West, in some parts of say, central London or New York. So the money gets recycled. The money that is spent by the West in Pakistan is taken out in many cases and put back in Western countries, benefiting the group of people who are actually setting policy. Now it is a laundromat where ultimately the people don't matter. They just need brute force and ideology to control the people. Now, this same sort of situation can be created in Bangladesh. And you essentially have not a carbon copy, but some version of Pakistan on our eastern front.
Right. Bit of a tangential question, right? But I'll ask it anyway. We see two types of America, right? The one type of America that can't tell its head from its rear, right? That let the Trump shooting happen the way it did, apparently because of a slope, right? They can't seem to control their homelessness or drug abuse problems, and are taking heck of a lot of time for simple infrastructure things like a subway station or a bus station or a bridge and so on and so forth, right? And then we see this other type of America that you guys are talking about, right? That such diverse interests like let's say the evangelicals and the neocons and the war machines and everything coming together in this like solid uniform policy towards one strategic goal as such, right? Like which of these two, I mean, how do you pair both of these, right? Perhaps, I mean, Ruchir, you can take this, and Surya, you can add.
Well, I'm sure you've heard of the saying, the purpose of a system is what it does. So if the US is incapable of solving homelessness, incapable of stopping school shootings, incapable of maintaining and building infrastructure, but it is capable of having an omnipresent, all powerful foreign policy where they can intervene in other countries as they please with very little short term repercussions, then it means that is the intended purpose of it. Everything is working the way it should. For them, domestic, say, the domestic issues around the prosperity and well-being of their citizens and their infrastructure is not a priority. It doesn't get them votes, it doesn't get them attention, it doesn't get them rewards, and that's also something that is decentralized. So a lot of this delivery happens in terms of local government, it happens in terms of state government. So the federal government in Washington D.C. can have a hands-off attitude to that it's someone else's problem. But when it comes to foreign policy, there's this, blob, as they call it, the core policymaking units, the policymaking elite, are all on the same page. So they all see America as this unique and special shining city on a hill that is surrounded by chaos and barbarism. And the only way to tame that is to literally go and tame and domesticate these wild animals and turn them into your pets, turn them into your client states. So that is what is incentivized, and hence all of their efforts go towards it. Now, regardless of which party is in power, this stays the same because both parties, at the end of the day, believe that the same founding myth around the U.S. and believe in the U.S.'s special self-appointed role as the world's policeman. So even if they try to, the Democrats will put a human face on it and say, "Oh, they're intervening because of human rights and democracy or something or values," whereas Republicans will say, "We're doing it to protect Christians or we're doing it to protect ExxonMobil's drilling rights." But at the end of the day, the outcome is the same. So when there's bipartisan policy consensus on that, they deliver. On domestic issues, then they can pretend to have all sorts of fights and both of them do nothing. And then there's constantly issues to fight your cultural wars and political wars about.
Right. Okay, back to Bangladesh. What do you guys think an interim government will be like, right? I think Mohammad Yunus has accepted, that he would be the leader. I don't know how, whether the opposite will be true, right? I mean, the people will accept him. And also, I don't know how long this interim government will last before there is free and fair elections again. But Surya, what do you think this interim government will be like?
This interim government, if we see the names that have been put out so far, it seems to be a very well pieced together group of individuals who, you have some people some professors, you have a Nobel laureate, obviously, who's going to be the prime minister, and you have activists, members of the student community, and then you have some Islamists as well, token individuals, but and you have some Hindus as well, Hindus and Chakmas. Now, this is for optics, let's be honest, because many of these individuals don't have a lot of political power themselves. As we know, with all states in the subcontinent and pretty much around in most parts of the world, unless you really have leverage within the society through groups that you influence who can affect ground realities right from your villages to your neighborhoods and your cities. If you cannot control that, you do not have power. So these individuals who form this government will be effectively toothless in many ways. The real question is, where is the incentive for anyone to listen to what Muhammad Yunus says? The only reason that they will listen to what he says is if the foreign powers that have been involved in this regime change operation have control to some extent, have leverage over those groups like, say, the Jamaat or other groups within Bangladesh, say some student groups, to make them accept the terms that Yunus puts forward for any issue, because nobody will listen to him. So this shows that when you have this sort of government, it will continue to be directed by foreign governments and their individuals who have influence on the ground. And this is a veneer of law and order. Under the hood of this, I fear that there could be systematic persecution on a very large scale of Hindus, to the point that the final objective of 1971 Operation Searchlight will be completed. If that does happen and you see mass-scale ethnic cleansing, while there's an interim government that is painted by the international press and the international governments as it's a very secular, democratic government, and under their watch, this happens. It's something India should be prepared for as a possibility. We're already seeing systematic persecution of Hindus. And we must remember that the Hindus at one point constituted 24% of Bangladesh's population in 21, systematically declined to around 10 to 15% about 20 years ago, where that 15% is not a small number. It kept the Awami League in power in some ways. It was the swing vote, and I mean, it was a loyal vote, but it was going to be the one that will always be loyal in some ways, to a large extent, to non-Jamaat groups, non-BNP groups. So when this community is pushed out, ethnically cleansed, the country of Bangladesh becomes an even more effective client state.
Right. I'll get to the specifics of this targeting of Hindus in Bangladesh, but again, seems like kind of a unique thing, right? How much 1971 factors in present day politics in Bangladesh, and considering that they're about 25 years younger than us, right? So 1971 matters more to Bangladesh than 1947 matters more to us in India, right? Ruchir, I mean, what could be the reasons for that? I mean, of course, Sheikh Hasina herself has like a direct connection with that. I mean, her father and the rest of her family, except for perhaps her sister, were massacred following that. Right, and she has been in power for about 5 terms now. But that aside, and of course, I mean, going back to why this whole thing started or what triggered this, it was about reservations for those freedom fighters from that time, right? So, why does it factor so much in present day Bangladesh, Ruchir?
So currently in Bangladesh, they're relitigating their past. So their foundational myth around how Bangladesh was created in the 70s and what happened in that transition period. So, as we know, the trigger for the secession of East Pakistan from the Pakistani project was multi-layered. So the elites of Pakistan have the elites of the Pakistan movement were rich landowning zamindars from UP and Bihar, who then migrated to Pakistan and got sidelined by the so-called martial race, the Pakistani Punjabis, the West Punjabis, who dominated the military. And initially, Pakistan had a provincial system. Then they had a two-unit system where West Pakistan and East Pakistan were equal. The big risk in the eyes of the generals in Rawalpindi was that they would be outpopulated and outnumbered within the Greater Pakistan by Bengali speaking East Pakistanis, who they saw as half Hindu and an inferior race because of their physical features and because of their proximity in cultural traditions and the way they dressed and the way they spoke. So Bengali, even if you see today, Awami League politicians speak Bengali in a very Bhadralok style, in a Sanskritized style. They use really classical words as very pleasant to hear. But then that was seen as a sign of these people being half mushrik, half idolatrous. And that's what led to Operation Searchlight, where the Pakistani army, dominated by West Punjabis, sought to purge East Pakistan of the inferior race, or I mean, in extreme terms, to cure their inferior race. So the governor of East Pakistan was Lieutenant General A.A.K. Niazi, and in a meeting with the military leadership under his command, he said in front of all of them, मैं इस हरामजादी कौम की नस्ल बदल दूंगा, which means, I'm going to change the race, the lineage of this bastard community, this bastard race, nation. And upon that, one of the Bengali Muslim military officers present there, he left the room and shot himself because he didn't want to take part in what was going to happen next. So what happened next was a purge of the Hindu community, which was 22% of East Pakistan, of the intellectuals, of the left-leaning political leadership. And it took a while. It took many months for international mobilization to come in from India, from the Soviet Union, from East Germany. And in the end, it was only after the monsoons that military intervention was possible. And so the Mukti Bahini, the homegrown rebels within the country who declared independence, so they were supported by the Indian Army. It was a massive victory for the Mukti Bahini and the Indian Republic. 93,000 prisoners of war were taken from West Pakistani forces. And that was the creation of Bangladesh, which was created as a repudiation of this West Pakistani Punjabi racial superiority. So it was about Bengali being the identity, as an ethno-linguistic identity and not Islam. So it was created initially as a secular republic, and they chose the term Bangladesh to make it inclusive, that it wasn't just for Bengalis, it was also for Chakmas, it was also for tribals. Now, a few years later, within 3 to 5 years of the declaration of Bangladesh, of Mujibur Rahman being the new leader of this new country, he was deposed in a military coup by Ziaur Rahman, who, over the next few years, Islamized the society because that was a useful ally to them. And a lot of these Razakars, as they were called, the collaborationists, so very often Bihari Muslims who had moved to East Pakistan or radicalized sections of Bengali Muslim society, they escaped punishment and became very loyal to this BNP party that Ziaur Rahman created, which was a Islamist party. So then, with time, the People's Republic of Bangladesh, despite being founded as a secular country, adopted Islam as the state religion, which is very bizarre. So it's not an Islamic republic, still People's Republic, but with a state religion, but claims to be secular. So this led to a lot of confusion and social turmoil about what does it mean? What did we fight this war for? Was it to create a society, a secular Bangladesh, which is about Bengali pride and heritage, or was it to make our own brand of military dictatorship, which was distinct from Pakistan but plays the same role and can leverage the same international support to develop itself, or to at least seek rents. Now, in order to purge society of these radical elements who attach themselves to the military regime after 1974, 75, 76, the government had brought in this quota in government jobs and universities for the descendants of freedom fighters, so that you cultivate patronage. So you as the state are giving patronage to what you see are the good guys, the ones who fought with the Mukti Bahini, and not the Razakars, not the collaborators who helped the Pakistanis in identifying their neighbors and lynching them, or purging intellectuals and Hindus and other minorities. So that's the social fabric as things stand, and it's being pulled in two different ways. Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League tried quite hard to crack down on this. They banned the BNP, they held elections without Islamist parties within it, but they also tried to co-opt some clerics to support their brand of politics, which met with limited success. But essentially, that's the socio-political background of where we are today. That they're still relitigating the first 5 to 10 years of their independence because they seesawed so much from being an integral part of Pakistan to being a brand new country with a new identity, and then falling back with a military coup and losing whatever they gained to become again a militarized Islamist garrison state.
Right. Um, Surya, you mentioned the targeting of the Hindu minority, right? We saw that in the protests. Pretty much, it was kind of secular. At least, I mean, it seemed like it, right? I mean, you had people from different religions come together and protest the whatever was happening. But then, since then, what has happened is like a systematic targeting of the minority, right? What do you think? Why do you think that happens, right? I mean, this whole and also, is it like a template thing, right? I mean, the left and Islam, you have this unholy alliance. Is this what awaits some of the left and Islam alliances in other parts of the world, when it reaches its eventuality?
I think that you raised a very important point here, Roshan, because this alliance between the left and the Islamists, and the sort of revolution that they can create, we saw that in 1979 in Iran, and what came after was a complete purge of all the communists, and anybody who was secular and who's had this hope of a inclusive and tolerant Iran. So they swung from being a monarchy, which was clearly not the most efficient and egalitarian system, to an Islamist system, and which I think you kind of see those same impulses here, in Bangladesh. Now, the the way that this can be controlled is in some ways by the military, which is what the Pakistanis have done. They kind of went for they said they were going to go for a secular state in the beginning, and then they quickly moved into the zone of being a military dictatorship, where they never let the Islamists control the government. If you see the Islamist parties in Pakistan, they only get a certain share. They have an influence. They can control mobs on the street, but ultimately the military and the agencies that are under its purview end up having assets in pretty much all political parties and controlling affairs. Now, the same sort of situation can end up happening in Bangladesh, where you have a puppet civilian government, and then you have other forces together which end up controlling these groups. Now, the persecution of Hindus as a part of this is, you will see that for the 7.5% or 7% of Hindus that are there in Bangladesh today, they will be driven down to around 2.5%, to a negligible number, so that they basically have zero capability of gathering together, like we saw in protests in some parts of Bangladesh now. They will not have any international voice, and they can be completely squeezed and persecuted to the point that they have no actual role in domestic politics. That means that India's influence, as the US would like to see, has basically been removed. And this is particularly important if you look at where the map of Bangladesh and the distribution of the demographics. You see in the Rangpur division in the north, near the Chicken's Neck area, there's a significant Hindu population. If they're expelled from that area, then the Chicken's Neck becomes even more vulnerable. If you look at down south near Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, there are pockets where there are large Hindu communities, pockets of large Hindu communities. Now, if those are they are removed and pushed back into some of the states in the northeast. Now, that area, which is between the border of the tri-junction between Bangladesh, India, and Burma, that area will end up, being vacant of any Indian influence. Now, this essentially contains India in some ways. So whatever decisions have to be made, we'll have to consider the longer term implications of American presence in the region, the proliferation, the systematic expulsion of Hindus, and I think this is one thing which we have not talked about, and actually nobody really on social media has discussed, the potential for conversion of Hindus to Islam and weaponizing those individuals for advancing jihad, not just in India, but in other parts of the world. We have seen this with, for example, Pinaki Bhattacharya. We have seen this with, there's another individual, I forgot his name. He was a Hindu, born in the early 80s. He was converted to Islam in Japan, and he came back, and then he was supporting the Islamic State. Now, we have a very different challenge in Bangladesh, because when you see a group of people, the original point was on leftists and Hindus joining the protests. Now, when they get massacred and they get driven out, or if they're kept within a cage, they don't have many options for survival. Some will convert. And those people will be they will be the most aggressive in waging war against India. This is something which needs to be discussed in more detail, and the risk of, and there's another major risk this is slightly left of field of your original question, and perhaps maybe a good point for us to start our next point of our discussion. We have tens of millions of illegal Bangladeshis and Rohingyas in India. Were they the advance force that was pushed in? Was the NRC and CAA targeted by Western governments and the media with the intention of preventing India from identifying illegals, so that when there is a regime change in Bangladesh and when the Jamaat does hold control over finances and communication lines and border security in Bangladesh, you end up having groups of people in India who are just waiting for instructions from their people back home. And where have they been settled? In all major cities, in India's holiest pilgrimage sites, in border areas like Jammu, and in the valley, near the border with China, in southern states, where there's PFI presence in Kerala, parts of Tamil Nadu. You have seen this across India, and there has been very little effort to remove these illegals. And when there is any talk of removing them, India has been told that there is an impending genocide of Muslims, when there's actually a genocide of Hindus taking place today in Bangladesh under the watch of a US installed regime.
Right. Ruchir, can India do something about the situation of Hindus in Bangladesh? We're seeing some very shocking visuals coming out of there. And the intent behind CIA also was to sort of take in these folks, right? And also be the last refuge for Hindus everywhere, right? And truly be that motherland as such. What should India's response be to this situation?
So there's a difference in what it should be and what it can be. So what it should be, there is an established precedent in terms of what to do in situations like this. So in 1971, when this happened, and there was a genocide and pogroms of the Bangladeshi Hindu community and of the intellectuals and left-leaning secular ecosystem within East Pakistan. Then India supported the homegrown liberation force, the Mukti Bahini. First of all, did that for a number of months. Then behind the scenes got countries like the USSR and East Germany on board. And then after the monsoon ended, intervened militarily. Now, this took time. It took diplomatic finesse. You needed to cover yourself, at the UN. You needed to cover yourself in terms of support from other countries. And back then, there was a bloc that was friendly to us and antagonistic towards the sponsor of Pakistan and the perpetrators of that genocide. In addition to that, there are also examples of other countries in the developing world that intervene militarily in their neighbors when reports of extreme radical regime conducting genocide took place. So, for example, in Uganda, how was Idi Amin removed in the end? He was removed because the neighboring country Tanzania invaded and deposed him. Pol Pot in Cambodia, he was supported by both China and the U.S. Even though he was a communist, because he was such an extreme communist, and did great work in discrediting the ideology in neighboring countries, because Vietnam was also communist, China was also communist, Laos next to it to the north was also communist. By creating this genocidal regime in the Khmer Rouge and Cambodia, they were very happy. The U.S. and China was that was like their second Pakistan. In the end, how was Pol Pot removed? It was because Vietnam invaded. Vietnam invaded and intervened and deposed the Khmer Rouge, got rid of Pol Pot, and put in a normal government afterwards. So, and they didn't. These three countries did so without the need of this, new invention of responsibility to protect of the UN, or invoking human rights, or saying that they're doing it for humanitarian purposes. They just did it, and now that power has been crystallized and removed from developing countries and given to the West, because they claim that they invented it in the 90s when they started intervening to save their pet dogs in Yugoslavia, in Kosovo, the province of Serbia, or in wherever they felt that they could intervene, in Libya or in Syria. So this is something that we have done in the past, and other countries friendly to us have done as well. Now, that's not something one can do right away for many reasons. One of which is, like I mentioned, even back in 1971, we had to wait for the monsoon to end in order for a military intervention to be feasible, and we needed to get at least one superpower on our side. Now, at the moment, there are two superpowers, but not the one that was friendly to us and supported us in the past. So Russia is no longer a superpower; it's a regional power, and it has its hands tied with its engagement in Ukraine. China has kept its cards close to its chest. It hasn't really come out in favor or against what's happening in Bangladesh so far. I'm pretty sure they're pragmatic and will find a way to work with whoever comes to power. Also, because the U.S. and China are co-invested in a broader goal, even though they dislike each other in terms of trade and they have frictions around Taiwan. They both agree that they should be the only two superpowers, and a third superpower shouldn't be allowed to arise. A third regional power shouldn't be allowed to rise. And so they're both invested in keeping India down, and they're both invested in uh, being pragmatic about who they work with. It doesn't matter if it's a dictatorship, doesn't matter if they're anti-communist, pro-communist, secular, Islamist. The Chinese have even said Pakistan is their Israel, that it's their attack dog who can do dirty work for them. And because of that, Pakistan doesn't say anything about minority rights in China, although it feels like it has the right to do so about India or other countries friendly to India. So that's what we could do. But then again, so it would take months to wait for a military operation to be feasible. In that time, you would also have the opportunity to see what happens in the US elections. If Kamala Harris wins, then it's going to be difficult to intervene, difficult to gather diplomatic support. If non-interventionists, in the Trump camp come to power, then it gives countries in the developing world a lot more leeway to pursue their self-interests, because you are less likely to get a moralistic lecture, or even if you still get a moralistic lecture, it won't translate into anything more than a few sanctions. They're not going to come and invade you. They're not going to come and do a regime change because it's a waste of effort for them. They want to focus on domestic consolidation and their economic trade rivalry with China. So it's quite possible that our policymakers are waiting to see how that pans out. That because military kinetic action is not possible until November, and November is when the election will take place, they'll know what they can get away with. But yeah, what we have seen in recent years is that basically in the second term of the Modi administration, so since 2019, 2020 onwards, there were two things that happened. One was in response to border aggression by China on the Indo-Tibetan frontier. We entered an intelligence sharing agreement with the US, which they now hold, as a sword of Damocles above us. That if we ever take domestic decisions or policies that they don't like, they threaten to cut us off from their intelligence sharing, which means a lot of policies that have domestic support, CAA, NRC, the farm laws, were all withdrawn in the face of manufactured opposition, foreign funded opposition through street power. And then the other change was that Trump lost power and Biden came in and empowered a lot of these interventionist policymakers who, as you've seen, have basically set the world on fire in Ukraine, in Gaza. Now they're trying to do so in Iran. They're trying their best to do it in Taiwan as well, and they've done successfully in Bangladesh. So, because of that, it feels like we've had policy paralysis for the past 4 years in India, If you can change either of these two limitations by some sort of creative diplomatic arrangement with China that makes us no longer dependent on the US for intelligence on that front, or by doing a regime change of our own and getting a friendly face in the White House who respects our sovereignty and says it's not, our place to comment on the domestic issues of other countries, then it's more likely to see us doing that. But if those two things don't change, even though there's many things we could do and should do, I don't know if it'll translate into what we will do.
Very well put. One of the things is that while we've been watching the events unfold in Bangladesh, right, there's kind of an eerie resonance to whatever has happened in India in terms of, let's say, these protests, whether it was, the farm laws, the CA, NRC, etc., or this fomenting of political instability, all these non-state actors, the NGO types, jumping in the fray and so on, right? So I guess, the question everyone really has is, can something like this ever happen in India? I think the better way to put it is, what is the likelihood of such a regime change being orchestrated in India? Surya, you could take this, and Ruchir, you can add.
Sure. I think that you can have foreign involvement clearly in domestic affairs because India is a democratic society. It's got its technology platforms which are imported from other countries, where its algorithms are controlled by foreign private organizations, which also are important to the U.S. government, those companies themselves. So you see that there's a lot of scope for influence from outside, and we've seen it happen. Street protests being used as a tool for overthrowing governments or to enforce policy paralysis, to prevent an economy from growing. You take a look at the farm laws; they were opposed by pretty much every major Western, even conservative financial publication, which was quite surprising until the protests resulted in the farm laws being withdrawn. After which they rued the policy paralysis itself. You saw the Western press playing a very clear role in supporting Khalistani separatists at the same time as they criticized the Indian government for reforms, while at the same time they would say that India must reform for it to become an able partner of the United States. So everything seems a bit contradictory here, given their policy of their strategic partnership with India. One can only deduce that, going by history, we see that no democracy in the world has ever grown to challenge the United States, has ever become a superpower. You look at Japan, Germany. After World War II, they were rebuilt essentially with American support. Germany under the Marshall Plan, Japan was allowed to rebuild its industries because it could get tariff-free access to the U.S. market. You saw these countries grow into industrial powerhouses. You saw Korea as well after the Korean War, South Korea developing. But again, with American presence on its soil. Japan with American presence on its soil. Germany with American presence on its soil. These countries, besides, Korea now to some extent has its own military industrial complex. Japan is, again, deeply plugged into the American security-led security architecture. Germany is a part of NATO. So no major industrial powerhouse as a democracy has ever grown to the size of even half of China. The Soviet Union grew not as a democracy. China grew not as a democracy. And one of the reasons we are told repeatedly as Indians that we do not have democracy is because we are actually attempting and having ideas of potentially becoming a global power. And they also know that the only way that you can prevent the country from becoming a global power is by using democracy, using elements that are friendly, that have extraterritorial allegiances, whether they are cultivated religious groups, minority religious groups, who are being converted in some cases by foreign funded religious organizations. They will be used to prevent a government from being able to take certain kinds of decisions. And you see this with the Khalistanis, largely foreign funded, with a domestic group, which can bring a government to a standstill on critical reforms, which would add 1 to 2% of GDP per year. India's baseline of GDP growth would be up at around 8% today. Baseline. On top of which any other reforms could take us to at least 10, which would make India get to the size of China potentially within 25 years. You will have, what would this mean for both China and the United States? That there's a third power in Asia, and that third power will have a mind of its own. More importantly, will control the Indian Ocean. If China controls the Western Pacific, India controls, or can basically control large parts of the Pacific. India controls the Indian Ocean. Where is the United States? This idea of RIC is never coming into fruition because of the India-China conflict. Because China believes that there can be only one tiger on the mountain, which means that India needs to become a junior partner, if at all, with accepting that the five-finger strategy will be something that the Chinese can execute at will, and it has to accept this kind of status as a country which should never develop to become the size of China, because that would show the Chinese political system in a poor light to the Chinese citizens. So therefore, India itself is being cornered, both by China and by the United States. And if you look at the literature produced by think tanks in the US, they talk about unipolarity and bipolarity. They outrightly reject multipolarity, which is something that the Indian establishment has been touting as something which will become a reality. But they are creating the outcomes in our neighborhood to make sure it does not become a reality. Because India's sovereignty and territorial integrity can be compromised at will through the sponsorship of insurgencies, through holding India hostage to Islamist terrorism, to Christian separatism, to the subversion of democracy by their groups which are operating within the Indian democratic system. So we are seeing this happen and unfold in front of our eyes. We have a bureaucratic establishment which does not have enough guardrails imposed by the government to prevent it from being subverted by foreign powers. You have bureaucrats with families in the United States or in Germany or in parts of the world which do not necessarily have which are not cooperating with India on many issues. There are many bureaucrats who would want to get post-retirement jobs in certain well-paying think tanks. Why will they pass those opportunities up for pushing an Indian line? They cannot do that if they take these roles. If their children are getting scholarships at Ivy League universities, or if even there's a promise of these bounties of gold for bureaucrats, why should they align with the Indian state? And this is exactly where the Indian government needs to come in to reform its own incentive structure to prevent this sort of subversion from happening. Now the question arises, if you start implementing these kind of reforms, you will draw the ire of pretty much every so-called democratic regime in these Western countries. Do you have the courage, number one, to push back against it, call a spade, and say that we don't care whether you call it democratic or anti-democratic, we're doing it for our benefit, for our interest. And if there are some economic costs for this, we're willing to take those economic costs. Because ultimately, this is a question of putting the cart before the horse. If you do not have a very strong domestic system, you will never be able to deliver on the economy, create the economic outcomes domestically, which will actually become attractive for foreign investments. Why is Vietnam an attractive destination for foreign investments? It is because it is a communist state which controls land and labor laws very aggressively, and it can be a hub for re-exporting Chinese goods to the United States. Why is India is doing that with Apple products, importing some electronics, and then exporting some of it to the United States and the Western world. But it is a tiny share of the pie. You want to grow an industrial base of your own, you need to have an independent mind of your own, an independent economic policy that is outside the neoliberal framework. The neoliberal framework, the so-called free market, has been established by the United States to keep unipolarity in place. And why do I say this? And I'm going slightly drifting a little bit, but I think it's a very important point. The US is preserving its hegemony by making sure that other countries buy into their version of the free market, where the rules of the free market are set by the US. And they did this with China, but then they had a transaction with China. China would sell them cheap goods because it could abuse human rights in exchange, in many ways, for being able to drive the cost of goods down to the point that it could become very attractive for Western countries to purchase. They could contain inflation, and through the 1980s, they could keep their interest rate policy in line. China became the biggest beneficiary to corporate America and the corporate West because of the interest rate policy that these countries could adopt. The Federal Reserve could adopt, and then later on the ECB, and the first European countries, and then the ECB could adopt. India is not being able to provide that use case to the world. China is adapting itself to continue to provide that use case to the world by exporting cheap goods, by building this industrial overcapacity, and being able to push cheap goods across the world, while India is not able to do this. India's use case for either China or the US is extremely limited. It's extremely limited. And therefore, we find ourselves being shown a dream. There's like this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and everyone is chasing this. You will have to accept that you will not become a developed country because of Western investments in India. It is not going to happen. You will have to become a developed country by making yourself extremely valuable to the world. Right now, you're not valuable. You're only valuable in parts, and that's why you're getting FDI only in parts. A trickle of FDI, $20 billion here, there, that's about it. China was pumping its economy with FDI for more than 40 years. You've not even gotten off the ground, which is why when you think there are some parts of your establishment that believe that you might get off the ground, you are told that, look, we can change a regime in your neighborhood, we can spread terrorism in your country, we can attempt a regime change inside New Delhi, and you can do nothing because you're dependent on our technology platforms, you're dependent on our FDI, and you're dependent on our intelligence.
Yeah. I mean, that scene where the Khalistani guy changed the flag at the Red Fort, right? I mean, that was a bit of a black pill for me, actually. We all know that the Indian state has its limitations and so on and so forth, but that to me was, it was terrible, really terrible. So Ruchir, you've just heard Surya paint a rather grim picture and also show us what the odds are against us. What do you think we could do, should do, and will do eventually?
Well, I think Surya did a very good job of enumerating the structural limitations that our state has. And in terms of the both the tools that it has, in its own hands, but also in terms of the incentive structure it provides for people to support it. That there's many people who want to support India, both within the bureaucracy and outside the country. But the country itself, the republic, the state institutions don't appreciate or seem to want that support because it's a status quo power. It's happy to keep things the way they are and bribe any restive sections of the population to not rebel, and then they're very proud. Oh, look, for 75 years, 77 years since independence, we've kept our territory intact and we've remained a democracy, as if that's some great achievement. Yay, we survived. You shouldn't be surviving, you should be thriving. Cockroaches survive a nuclear holocaust. That's not something to be proud of. It shouldn't be about, oh, we did just enough to survive. And That's something that only structural reform can address. That it was Kwame Nkrumah, the first prime minister and then the first president of in independent Ghana, who said the best way to learn how to be a sovereign state is to start being a sovereign state. So you're not going to, just sit around and observe what the others are doing and be like, oh yeah, I took some good notes, and you don't apply it. You have to learn from the best. You have to learn from good examples. You have to learn from bad examples. What made China great today? That during the Dengis period, they watched very closely what happened to the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc in the late 80s and early 90s. And they studied that extensively. That what mistakes did they make that led to their collapse, that led to their power being pulled out from underneath them. And they have reoriented their state to ensure that that never happens to them. So the Chinese, the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China, have two motivating factors in terms of negative experiences. One is what they call the century of humiliation. That China was never fully colonized, but it was economically colonized, and it was pumped full of opium that degraded and demoralized their society, and they consider that an aberration. That Chinese history is glorious, where we were the middle kingdom, where we were the center of the world, the richest country, traded with everyone. Everyone else was our vassal, and they paid tribute to our monarch, except those 100 years where the Westerners came and humiliated us. In fact, colonization would have been preferable. The Japanese did try to colonize China during the Second World War, and it was that experience that galvanized Chinese society and gave them, a reason to unite and drive out the foreigners. And so, for that, they say that they need to ensure that they never have a century of humiliation again, but also they restore their position as the Middle Kingdom. And the other is to make sure that what was done to the Soviet Union doesn't happen to them, and they lose their newly acquired superpower status. Now, I don't know if anyone in the Indian policymaking establishment has thought on these lines, because there is a very good parallel to India's experience, and that's Yugoslavia. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia is very similar to India in terms of its foundational history, in terms of its structural weaknesses, and in terms of what it offered to the world. So this was a federal republic that was created after the war. It was a non-aligned country that advertised itself to the world as a bridge between East and West. That because we're non-aligned and we have good relations with both, we can put one foot in one boat and one foot in the other, and they would extort concessions from both. So they would get a lot of foreign investment from the US, which they pumped into their economy, which was great. It became the richest country in Southeastern Europe. They had infrastructure that even Greece, a Western aligned country on the southern border, didn't have. They had malls, they had escalators, they had highways. They had a very strong industrial sector, shipbuilding, steel, auto manufacturing. But then when the money dried up, when the investment dried up, then they needed loans from the West, and these came with conditions. They came with really, strict conditions. The interest rates were high, and once the country was no longer useful to the West as a bridge, once under Reagan and Gorbachev, the East-West tensions went away through détente, and they'd start to work together. Then they didn't need a helpful non-aligned country to sort out their differences or to act as a conduit. And they said, all right, it's time to pay back the loans. And they forced Yugoslavia to reorient their economy to paying back these loans that were given through the Washington institutions, through the IMF, directly through the World Bank, directly from the US. And that led to hyperinflation. It led to a deterioration in living standards. And this coincided with the death of Tito, who was also, this God King figure. Now, everyone was getting along quite well until these economic pressures were artificially placed on the country. If you were a secessionist, you were locked up in jail. End of story. But then, when the state started losing its capacity, started losing its legitimacy because it wasn't delivering material outcomes, these frictions became higher, and the cost of throwing these separatists in jail became a lot higher as well in terms of diplomatic intervention from other countries. And so people think that the country broke up because Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Muslims are, ancestral enemies and are incapable of getting along. No, those divisions had been papered over, and then the cracks were reopened by Western interventionism, who then said to the separatist leaders, if you declare an independent Croatia, if you declare an independent Slovenia, all those debts that are owed by Yugoslavia, they still belong to the capital city. They still belong to Belgrade. They become their problem. We'll wipe it all off for you. You join NATO. You join the EU. We'll give you funding. We'll give you arms. We'll give you diplomatic recognition the moment that you declare independence. And that's how they dismembered the country. And Serbia tried to keep the country together and was villainized for it. And even today is seen as the big villain of that region, despite having done what it could to maintain that multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, happy socialist federal country. And this is what they have, the West has in mind for India. By opening these fronts, it's the first step in their long-standing Balkanization plan to turn India into 6 or 7 smaller authoritarian republics that when Washington cracks the whip, they do what they're told. When they say jump, these, the new Dravida Nadu or the new Khalistan, they'll say, how high, master? That's what they want. And I don't know if our policymakers are visionary enough or understand risk management to have studied what went wrong and not repeat those mistakes, or to insulate ourselves from creating a situation where it's easy to break us up and it's easy to heighten these fault lines. That the purpose of the republic shouldn't just be to survive, it should be to thrive. It should be to create the circumstances, to create an enabling environment where poverty is impossible, where dignity is guaranteed to people, where people are proud of their ancestors and their heritage, and where there's a collective sense of purpose of what we are as a nation and where we're going. This is what Vietnam has done. This is what China has done. This is what every successful developing country that has made progress in the last 40 years has done. And we only adopted economic reforms in the early 90s under duress because our arms were forced, but we didn't take the political, social, or philosophical reforms that these other countries took alongside. And as a result, we're constantly on the back foot. Half the time, we're not even playing at it. To use a cricket metaphor, we're just leaving the ball when it comes. We're not even on the back foot and defending and blocking the ball. We just let it pass to the keeper and hope to survive. So the Indian state today is like Ajit Agarkar batting in 1999 in Australia. That you've got out for duck so many times that now you just need to not get out for a duck. You block, leave the ball. Eventually, you score 1 run, and the whole stadium claps for you on the next. So, wow, he scored 1 run. He didn't get out. That's the Indian state.
I want to add a couple of points to what Richard said, and I think that he made some fantastic points in this. If we go back in history and we look at where the British really carved out their first real sphere of influence in the subcontinent, it was in Bengal, at the mouth of the Ganga, right? So the Northeast has always been an area which got a lot of attention from evangelical groups from from independence onwards. This was always eyed as the first domino for the Indian Republic to fall apart. And alongside, there has been efforts to spread Christianity in Punjab more recently and in the south, specifically in Tamil Nadu and in Andhra. And this has been done with the idea of slowly building around a 10% base population, which also there's been activities in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, in Bihar for very long to cultivate a group of people across the country who will, when that first domino, if it falls in the Northeast, can start pushing for secessionism using the existing so-called federal architecture that when they talk about stronger federalism in India, better sort of devolution of power to the states. In fact, these states are unwieldy states, and Ruchir has talked about this in previous podcasts. There's been a book also written on this by another author where we talk about breaking up the states into several small administrative units because you de-risk you reduce the probability of balkanization when you give the power to local authorities and kind of take away the power from these family parties that are running large states and from these power centers which actually do not deliver much good to large parts of their state. They benefit small parts of their state wherever economic activity is taking place, and that those areas continue to grow. And broad-based economic development does not happen, and the feudal structure of democracy continues to persist, where patronage is given by a certain set of established political forces. When you break down the states into smaller units, there's much more competition that gets induced. And the stranglehold that these regional parties sometimes have over domestic political affairs starts changing. You have new political forces that come into play. And when this happens, you reduce the probability of major sorts of efforts to destabilize the country from outside. You take a look at, for example, Maharashtra as a state with about more than 100 million people. It could easily be split into 4, 5, or more states, 3 at least. But the economic center, which basically bankrolls these political parties, will be located only in one part of the country, and one part of the state, or rather one state. And now the other states will have to pull their weight and try to develop. Now, it becomes much harder for foreign forces to come in to destabilize to kind of carve out a large state out of this. When I talked about the domino effect from the Northeast, the first 2 states which will end up really pushing for secessionism are Punjab and Tamil Nadu. And then you will start seeing other states getting destabilized along the way. And then you start seeing your 2 Islamist client states, Pakistan and Bangladesh, pushing further and further, using their proxies inside the country to create more anarchy. India was never envisaged to last for as long as it has lasted by Western powers. They never thought that it would even continue till date. The binding force of India is Hinduism, whether anyone likes it or not. The reason why we are told repeatedly by the foreign press, by foreign governments, and the local media that anything related to Hinduism being this glue that sticks the country together is somehow an affront to secularism, which is supposed to be the real binding force of the country. That is repeated to us ad nauseum because that is a tool for breaking the country in the long run. And when we look at the textual evidence from other countries, when they study India and when they talk about how the world order will be shaped, and when I go back to this point of unipolarity and bipolarity and no multipolarity, we see that the final effect of this will fall on the largest country, which can potentially become the next China, can at least command 50-60% of Chinese GDP within the next 25 years, maybe 20 years, or maybe even surpass China in the next 4 decades, potentially, depending on how its reforms are implemented. It is told repeatedly that you cannot have a state capitalist system. You have to adopt a neoliberal system where you integrate with the rest of the world. You play by the rules that the West sets for you because you want to become an exporter and you want to develop your economy. And if you do not, a state capitalist system requires a slightly more authoritarian mode of government. You cannot adopt that because that is really what delivers prosperity to the masses. You have to adopt a system which will perpetually hobble you. Your internal systems, your bureaucratic system, your judiciary are all operating on a Western operating system. Just like how your narratives are being disseminated using a Western technology platforms. When we talk about decolonization, it is something that is related to India's national security in the long run. It is about its long-term existence. And when we talk long-term, we talk about in our lifetime, within the next 20 to 30 years. When Romila Thapar said that we may not last as a unified entity by 2047, she said something to this effect. Now, she's essentially parroting the line that has been said in behind the scenes in Western capitals for decades. So, do you want to stand up to this? Do you want to actually say that democracy is not a showpiece? It is something that is used and can be altered. Its system can be altered to serve India's objectives, not to try, and it is supposed to serve our security interests. This idea that when today's leader of the opposition before had said that India is a negotiation. This is how India has constantly survived from day to day because it believes that it is only a negotiation. You constantly negotiate, but you can keep doing this when you are poor. But when you start getting slightly richer and slightly more powerful, and you may have some ambitions, then you are told that then this negotiation is actually about a negotiation to balkanize the country. It is not a negotiation to keep the country together. So you need some major reforms, and if those reforms are not implemented, then, and you are not willing to take the violence that comes in response to those reforms, because there will be violence from some small pockets. In a country of 1.4 billion, if few 100,000 riot, it's something that the Indian state should be able to deal with. If you don't have the stomach to deal with violence, then you will never take that leap to the next stage. You will never get onto that hockey stick growth. You will never make yourself that useful to other countries that they will say they will lay off and they will start investing a bit. They will keep trying to constrain you. You will not have friends, many friends, but you will have to keep taking these big decisions and shifting the Overton window, making it more difficult. And that's how you actually throw other countries off balance, to prevent them from actually constraining you. Right now, you're getting strangled. And not one person in the Indian establishment is willing to call out the United States for what they are doing. And ultimately, it is common people who will have to come out onto podcasts and talk about it with a certain amount of reach, but will it reach the masses? Because ultimately, their American capital is the most seductive thing that is there in India today, because everybody wants material prosperity. When you have a section of society which is not interested in material prosperity, which is interested in hijacking democracy along with their friends on either side of the country. You have another group which is literally a puppet of Western countries, another demographic, and you're going to get cornered from the inside using democracy. So how do you change the system? As I talked about, and as Richard had mentioned before, breaking the states up, instituting administrative reform, bureaucratic reforms, changing the incentive structures and reducing risk.
Yeah, I would also say that since you mentioned my writings about this, which have been published in one of Rajiv Malhotra's latest books, so The Power of Future Machines, you can read my consolidated thoughts there about how to engage on this constitutional reform. It's not enough to just break down the states. What we should do is strip them of legislative power. Why do we need legislative assemblies acting as mini parliaments? Why do we need chief ministers acting like the rajas of each state as their fiefdom? We have 750 districts, and we should have only a relationship with the central government, between the central government and the district level administration. And you should have district level democracy. You should be able to elect your city mayor. You should be able to, yeah, and there should be like a elected president, an executive president. You should be able to choose you shouldn't have a district magistrate that's just an IAS officer. You should be able to elect your district administrator, your prefect, who is like the executive president of your district, so that each district, each citizen has an experience of direct democracy. They're not disconnected by multiple layers and levels of policymaking, and you also neutralize the threat of an entire state seceding because no single district has the power to do that, and if they do, you can easily crush it. That's one point I just wanted to elaborate on, and the other where Surya mentioned, about having this, what I would call a Leitkultur in German, so a leading culture. So the leading culture of many countries is, well established. So, for example, the U.S., yes, it is a secular country. It has a separation of church and state, but that's not done to protect the state from the influence of the church. It's done to protect the church from the influence of the state. And culturally, it is a Protestant country. So I remember there's a Pakistani Ahmadi commentator on social media, on X, on Twitter, who said, and it was a really good quote, that everyone in the US is a Protestant, even Jews and Muslims. Yeah, even Catholics. Even you might think that you're a Catholic, you might think that you're a Muslim, you might think that you're a Jew, but if you're an American, you are a Protestant by default because you've been conditioned to think in a certain way, and you've actually been disconnected from the core theology of your belief system. And that is also true of India, that despite being a secular republic, society does have a Hindu leading culture. And although I don't agree with what the RSS says that all Indians are Hindus, including Muslims and Christians, but I would say it in a different way. That just like Jews and Catholics and Muslims in America are Protestants by default, by association, without realizing it, Indian Muslims and Indian Christians are not fully Muslim and they're not fully Christian. And you can ask any theologist from Iran or from Saudi Arabia or from the Vatican what they think, and they'll say the same, because if they were, they would be easily assimilated into those countries. But they're not. They're seen as half Hindu because culturally they are. And it's only recently that they've been radicalized through foreign money into seeing themselves as fully crystallized separate ethnicity and identity. The leadership, that was exposed to the West. So people like Sir Syed Ali Khan, who created AMU, and then the Jinnahs and the Shaukat Alis, they became radicalized because they were given support and patronage from the British and from the larger West. And now that support, has multiplied because it comes not just from the West, it comes from the Vatican, it comes from evangelical churches, it comes from the Middle East, and no longer just from Saudi Arabia or Iran or from the Emirates. It comes from Qatar, it comes from Malaysia, it comes from Turkey, who are all fighting to create, to make Muslims more Muslim, or to make Christians more Christian, because they know that our minorities are part of a larger Hinduized society, and they're trying their best to alienate them from them and reward them for secessionism, which is unfortunate because our state, our society should be creating a pull factor that keeps people engaged with their roots, with their ancestors, with their broader engagement with the rest of society. But instead, as Surya said, the state sees itself, as this mediator between these communities who are negotiating with each other, and you have to bribe the troublemakers to shut up and and play nicely, rather than creating a shared narrative of saying, this is us and we're going forward. And the best example to learn from is Rwanda. I hope we don't ever reach the stage that it took Rwanda to fix the colonial fissures that the Belgians created in their society. But Rwanda today, under Paul Kagame, has solved all the issues that India has been facing for the last 70 years. And he did it because he had the willingness to get his hands dirty. It's a very rare example where the victims of the genocide won the civil war because they had an appetite to do it. They didn't just sit back and let themselves get massacred. Their diaspora came back from Uganda, came back from the neighboring countries, won the war, and reshaped society in a way that this would never happen again. They removed any reference. So it's illegal for the government of Rwanda, and it's illegal for citizens to ask them what their ethnicity is, or to give people different levels of access to government services or legal rights. Everyone is one citizen. They practice their faith. They can be proud of their ethnicity in their private life, but it should not affect your relationship with the state and with each other.
It's a very good point. In fact, this should be done in India in some way with strong, powerful local leaders. When you break the states up, all your local leaders have to be strong enough to make sure that these sorts of reforms are implemented, and then it is driven by a national project, a national mission. Of when you talk about, instead of trying to treat the country as a negotiation, you try and you're not homogenizing, you're trying to create a sense of stronger social trust, and also the relationship between the state and the people. That social contract needs to be strengthened. Right now, the systems in place are designed only to perpetuate the power that exists that rests with the bureaucracy primarily, which treats the people as subjects of a sort of neo-colonial state. And this is something Ruchir has talked about a lot in his previous discussions, and I encourage people to watch those podcasts as well, because unless you reform this, territorial integrity and sovereignty, as I mentioned in my previous bit, will not be guaranteed in the long run. And when you talk about charting your own path, and I think that there's some policymakers in India who kind of get this, that we want to chart our own path, we want to be a balancing power, and then we kind of want to grow right now in the shade of the US and China, but then eventually become a tree of our own, a pole of our own, with our own shade that we have over our neighborhood, and reestablish the Indosphere perhaps through this. But this is, to prevent this, if you see what has happened in Bangladesh, this was a perfect example of an attempt to show that you are not capable of doing this, and we will actively work against any effort for you to make yourself into another pole in the world, as another tree with its own shade. Right? This is like, look at the process of integration that India has been trying to. It's Act East policy. It's not been able to get off the ground to the extent that it should have because of insurgencies in the Northeast. Infrastructure connectivity is always held hostage to this. Your investments in Bangladesh are now under question. I mean, yes, you will continue to have leverage because of of just how geography works, but that influence, when it starts waning, also with the help of radicalization and the reemergence of pan-Islamist subcontinental radicalization, which is now going to accelerate because of what happened in Bangladesh, you're seeing an effort to box the country in and to limit its aspirations. And if India does not become a 20 trillion, 30 trillion, 20 trillion economy, does not double its GDP at least for on average for over the next 20 to 25 years, it risks these major problems. The same problems that were there in Bangladesh, which started off with economic issues as well, which kind of combined with political issues and ended up in regime change. You can end up having this on a local level, and also if the country is not able to accelerate on a pan India basis, you can have this on a national level. And this is one of the issues when you talk about can regime change happen in the long run in India? It could happen with a puppet government being installed through the proliferation of false narratives through American tech platforms. Or it could be the slower burner, where the country is constricted and then slowly you create the Bangladesh sort of conditions, but on a pan India basis, which will take much, much longer.
I think that's perhaps the most comprehensive answer anybody's heard, for the kind of question that I asked you, right? I mean, but look, it's easy to get overwhelmed when you hear, phrases like structural reforms and of course, the depth and the nuance of the things that you brought up. But it also means there are just so many levers for us to really improve our productivity or sovereignty, so on and so forth, right? I mean, so I tend to look at it slightly more optimistically, right? So all right, to bring the discussion to a close, let's get back to Bangladesh. I'd love to hear a quick comment on how India-Bangladesh relations will be like going forward, right? Of course, Sheikh Hasina is here in India, and perhaps not the best thing for us because she's been painted as an India stooge at this point, which she definitely wasn't, right? But what do you think will happen going further? How will we negotiate with this new government? And considering also that Bangladesh, of course, I mean we have the largest border with Bangladesh, right? So just some quick thoughts from either of you.
Yeah, just two lines on this. I think that we will have to let the chips fall where they are, and then we will reassess. We'll look into. It's not like India has lost communication channels inside Bangladesh. That's not true. It has lost some communication channels, but it is very possible for India to continue to negotiate with people in Bangladesh and also with the U.S. Because it's not like India does not have leverage in certain domains, especially in relation to China, U.S. and China. My point earlier about how India and the U.S. will kind of negotiate certain aspects of how Bangladesh is going to operate, I think that holds true. And it's not going to be an easy process, but stability in this new sort of emerging garrison state is ultimately kind of what we would like to see. Um, Monitoring how the Hindu community and Awami supporters, Muslim Awami supporters, are being treated will come into focus over the next few months. And I guess that as a new reality comes into being, India will recalibrate its Northeast strategy. It will also have to decide how it will deal with a new set of internal security threats, because you will not have a friendly government which will crack down on terrorism. So, given that, we would have to deal with the internal security threats and the problems of illegal migration that have grown over the years, in accordance with that. If we have the appetite to deal with that, then perhaps we'd be able to secure ourselves and kind of ring fence ourselves from some of the fallout of this problem.
Right. Last word to you, Ruchir.
All right. What I would say is if we think we are a superpower or an aspiring superpower and we wish to act like one, we need to start acting like one, at least in our backyard, as a regional power. So think of what would other countries do if this happened on their doorstep? To a country that is a fraction of your size, that has only a couple of seaports, and which was dependent on you for protection until recently. So if you really want to, you can blockade their ports. You can apply sanctions on the country. You can refuse recognition. You can say that Sheikh Hasina remains the legitimate leader of this country. You can ask her for permission as the prime minister. Unfortunately, she resigned. If she had been deposed and hadn't resigned herself, we could say that she has invited us as the head of government to intervene. Sadly, that's not the case, but you can sanction the country. You can refuse to have relations with them. You can blockade their ports. You can declare a no fly zone. It's not a nuclear power like Pakistan. What are they going to do? Choke the country and bring them to their knees. And you tell them that it's conditional upon the protection of minorities and the restoration of democracy in the country. And the more the Americans and the Germans and the Canadians squeal, there's tons of them in our country. Pick up one at random, throw them in jail, no trial for 6 months. Do one every day, every day, every day. One German in jail, one Canadian in jail, one American in jail. The more they scream, the more you do it. And then this is what Iran would do if this happened on its doorstep. This is what Russia would do if it happened on its doorstep. This is what China would do. And forget these. This is what Vietnam would do. This is what Rwanda would do. This is what Venezuela would do. Are we lower than Rwanda? Are we lower than Venezuela? Are we a sovereign country? Act like one.
Okay. On that inspiring note, we're going to bring this discussion to a close. Going into this conversation, I was expecting a lot of nuances, but I just couldn't estimate the number of rabbit holes we'd go down. This was just absolutely wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Surya and Ruchir, for being part of this. Really, I think we'll be coming back to this many times over in the years ahead for sure, right? I mean, thank you again, and look forward to hosting you guys again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting us and for the great questions, the great conversations and discussions. It was really, really fruitful.
I think we have a lot of topics now for further conversations.
Absolutely.
I think one of them can be internal security going forward.
Yeah, this is like a podcast of podcasts, I think.
Yes.
All right,
Absolutely.
guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to the end of another fascinating episode. Both Ruchir and Surya did not disappoint. We had many different nuanced perspectives on a wide range of things. And if you liked this content, don't forget to share and subscribe. We're at Bharatvaarta on all social media platforms. Do follow us and share our content as well. So I will see you on another episode of Bharatvaarta. Until then, do stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.